Sarah walked down the narrow aisle of the crowded airplane, her eyes scanning over the passengers with practiced precision. She had seen it all over the years, from crying babies to passengers arguing over window shades. But today, something felt different. As she passed each row, a strange tension hung in the air, something subtle, but undeniable. She couldn't quite place it yet. But there was a feeling gnawing at the back of her mind that something was off. Her gaze landed on a man sitting by the window. His wrinkled suit was mismatched, and his shirt collar was slightly undone. His eyes darted back and forth, nervously glancing at the emergency exit signs above his head every few seconds. As if checking for a way out, he had the appearance of someone who had just thrown on whatever they could find before rushing out the door, like they were running from something. But she couldn't be sure. She had seen enough to know not to jump to conclusions, yet still her instincts told her to keep an eye on him. As she moved closer, she noticed the way his hands gripped the armrest, his knuckles white with tension. She studied him for a moment, more trying to get a read on him. Was he nervous from flying, or was there something else going on? It wasn't uncommon for people to get anxious on planes, but this felt different. His discomforts seemed more intense, more calculated, like he was trying to hide something. Maybe it was just her intuition, or maybe it was just a bad feeling that came from being around so many people on long flights. But something told her to pay attention to this man. The moment she reached his row, he looked up at her quickly, his eyes darting away from hers. As though caught doing something wrong, he smiled nervously, his lips pulling tight across his face. She tried to mask any suspicion from her expression, and asked him if he was all right. He hesitated for a second longer than usual, before responding in a voice that was almost too calm for someone in his position. "Yes, everything's fine," he said. But his eyes never met hers, not once. His gaze kept flicking around the cabin, like he was looking for something, but Sarah couldn't tell what. She nodded politely and moved on, but her curiosity lingered. It wasn't just his strange behavior that had caught her attention. It was the way he seemed so out of place on this flight. Something about him didn't fit the typical profile of a nervous passenger. He didn't look like someone who had just boarded a plane for the first time and was unsure about what to do. He looked like someone who had been through this before too many times, almost as if he knew exactly where every exit was, every aisle, every potential danger. As she continued her rounds, she found herself glancing back at him. Every few rows he hadn't moved an inch. His hands still gripped the armrest, his posture stiff, as if he were bracing for something. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept walking. She didn't want to alarm anyone, especially herself. But it was hard to shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. She had seen passengers act strangely before, but this was different. There was an urgency to his presence, an unease that made her question whether he was hiding something, or if he was simply afraid of something she couldn't see. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of routine, and yet Sarah couldn't help but check in on him every now and then from the corner of her eye. Each time she saw him, he looked more and more unsettled, a bead of sweat now forming on his forehead. He wiped it away quickly, but it didn't escape her notice. She felt an uneasy tension building inside of her, but she couldn't place why. She had dealt with difficult passengers in the past, and nothing about this man screamed immediate danger. But the nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't go away, and she knew deep down something wasn't right. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling as she moved through the cabin. The tension in the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. The man by the window still hadn't moved, and every time she glanced at him, he was staring at the emergency exit signs, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly. His fingers were turning white. It was as if he was preparing for something. But what was it? She couldn't figure out, and that bothered her. She had dealt with anxious passengers before, but nothing quite like this. His behavior wasn't just the typical nervous flyer. His eyes darted back and forth, like he was searching for something, like he was waiting for something to happen. But there was no indication of what it might be. The plane had been cruising smoothly. The captain had announced the expected altitude, and they were on course. There was nothing unusual about the flight itself. So why was this man acting like this? Sarah continued with her duties, serving drinks and snacks, while keeping a subtle watch on the man. His every movement seemed out of place. She couldn't pinpoint it, but her instincts were telling her to be cautious. There was something unsettling about the way he kept glancing at the exit, like he was counting down the seconds until something would change. As the flight went on, the man seemed to grow more and more restless. He shifted in his seat constantly, as if he couldn't get comfortable. His hand brushed against his pocket, as though checking for something every few minutes, his fingers twitching like they were nervously fumbling for something. She couldn't tell if he was looking for a phone or a weapon or something else entirely, but it was clear that whatever it was something important to him. Sarah tried to brush it off and focus on her responsibilities, but her eyes kept straying back to him. There was a tightness in her chest that she couldn't explain. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her, or maybe it was the exhaustion from a long flight, but she couldn't ignore the gut feeling that something wasn't right about this man, and the longer she watched him, the more that feeling grew. Then she noticed something even stranger. He reached down into his briefcase and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. His hands shook as he smoothed it out and began to stare at it, his eyes scanning the document frantically. He seemed to be looking for something specific, but the paper was too far for her to read. All she could make out were a few letters and numbers, but what struck her was the fact that he was clearly agitated by whatever it was. She had never seen anyone act like this before, especially not in such a public space. As Sarah moved past him once again, she couldn't resist glancing over his shoulder just for a split second to catch a glimpse of what he was looking at. But by the time she did, he had folded the paper back up and placed it into his briefcase, his hands still trembling slightly. She tried to calm herself and dismiss the thought, but her curiosity was getting the best of her. There was something about that paper that seemed important. Maybe it was just her overactive imagination, but she had a nagging feeling that whatever it was, it could have something to do with why he was so on edge. The plane suddenly hit a patch of turbulence, and Sarah felt the familiar lurch in her stomach. As the plane shook, she steadied herself and checked on the passengers, making sure everyone was secure. But when she reached the man's row, she saw him grab onto the armrests tightly, his face paling. In an instant, his knuckles were as white as the paper he had been holding just moments before, and his breath came in short, shallow bursts. Sarah paused for a moment, unsure of what to do. Was it the turbulence that was causing him to panic? Or was it something else, something more sinister? She watched him, carefully waiting for him to settle down. But instead, he stood up suddenly, his movements jerky, and hurried. He muttered something under his breath as he made his way to the restroom. But his gait was unsteady, almost like he was trying to escape something. And that's when Sarah knew that whatever was going on with him was much more than just nerves. Sarah watched as the man hurried toward the restroom, his steps quick and unsteady, his hand gripping the back of the seat in front of him, like he needed something to steady himself. She couldn't help but feel a pang of concern, but at the same time her mind raced with questions. What was he running from? What was he hiding? As the man disappeared behind the restroom door, Sarah felt a strange unease settle in the pit of her stomach. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried to rationalize it away. She continued her rounds, serving drinks to the passengers and checking on the others, but her eyes kept returning to the restroom door. Every few moments, she couldn't shake the nagging thought that something wasn't right with the man. She had seen his face contoured with anxiety before he disappeared into the bathroom, and that expression lingered in her mind. The longer she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. She had seen a lot over the years, but this was different. This felt like something was about to happen. Minutes ticked by, and Sarah felt the tension in the air grow thicker. It was as if the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting for something. She tried to focus on her work, but her eyes kept drifting back to the bathroom door. It had been far too long since the man had entered. He should have been back by now. Unless something was keeping him there, or worse, unless he was up to something. Finally, she couldn't take it any more, her curiosity getting the best of her. She walked to the restroom door and knocked gently. At first no answer. She knocked again a little louder, but still nothing. Sarah's heart began to race. She reached for the handle, but it was locked. She paused for a moment, debating whether to call for help. But then she heard the faint sound of movement coming from inside the bathroom. It was too quiet to be just a passenger using the facilities. It sounded like something more, something that set her on edge. With a deep breath, she knocked again, this time more urgently. "Sir, are you okay?" She asked, her voice steady, but with a hint of concern. There was a long pause before the door clicked open, and the man stepped out. He looked disheveled, his hair messy, his clothes wrinkled. As if he had been in a hurry, he avoided making eye contact with her, his gaze shifting to the floor, and then to the side as if he couldn't bear to look at her. "Everything all right?" Sarah asked, her voice cautious. She couldn't quite explain it, but she felt like she was walking a fine line here. She wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, but something was off about his entire demeanor. The man nodded quickly and mumbled a response. "Yeah, just needed a minute." But his voice was too flat, too rehearsed, and Sarah could tell he wasn't being entirely truthful. He stepped past her and returned to his seat without another word, his movements stiff and hurried. Sarah watched him for a moment longer, trying to read his body language, but there was no sign of relief, no sign that he was settling back into his seat, as if everything was normal. Instead, he sat down as quickly as he could, his eyes darting around the cabin again, his fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. The same nervous energy was still radiating from him, and Sarah's gut told her something wasn't right. She continued her work, serving food and drinks to the other passengers, but her mind kept drifting back to the man, his strange behavior, the way he had acted in the bathroom, and the unsettling feeling that something was going to happen. But what exactly, Sarah couldn't say. All she knew was that every instinct in her told her to be ready to act quickly if the situation took a turn. As the flight went on, she kept her distance, but her eyes never stopped watching him. Each time she glanced his way, she saw the same anxious expression, the same tense posture. He hadn't relaxed at all, and every now and then she caught a glimpse of his fingers trembling as they gripped the armrest. It was becoming harder and harder to ignore the sense of danger in the air, and Sarah knew she had to stay vigilant, even if she couldn't quite explain why. Sarah couldn't ignore the growing unease that was settling in her chest. The longer the flight went on, the man by the window still hadn't relaxed. His posture remained stiff, and every few minutes he would glance around the cabin, as if looking for something. He had been acting strangely since the moment she first noticed him, but now his behavior had taken a new turn. He was restless, in a way that wasn't typical for a nervous passenger. This wasn't just anxiety. This was something more, something that gnawed at Sarah's gut, like a warning signal she couldn't ignore. She watched him for across the aisle, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? Why was he so nervous? And what was he waiting for? She had seen enough suspicious passengers in her time to know when something wasn't right. But this was different. It felt like a puzzle that was missing a crucial piece, and she needed to figure it out before it was too late. As she moved through the cabin, she saw him glance at his watch again, and then quickly turn his head toward the emergency exits. Sarah's eyes narrowed. There was something about the way he looked at those exits that made her stomach tighten. It wasn't the usual glance of a nervous flyer. It was more like he was calculating his options, like he was planning his next move. But why would someone do that on a commercial flight where everything was supposed to be safe and predictable? The thought sent a chill down her spine as Sarah continued with her duties. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was building in the air, like a storm ready to break. She tried to focus on her passengers and keep things moving smoothly, but her attention kept drifting back to the man. She had to know what he was up to. Just then she noticed something even stranger. the man reached into his briefcase and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. His hands were shaking so much that he could barely hold it steady. His eyes scanned the paper frantically, as if searching for something. And then he folded it up quickly and shoved it back into the case, almost as if he was trying to hide it from view. But Sarah had seen enough. She had caught a glimpse of the letters and numbers on the paper, and they didn't look like anything that belonged on a typical flight manifest. She couldn't let this go on any longer. Her instincts were screaming at her to take action. Sarah walked to the galley, where she found her colleague Ben, a fellow flight attendant who had been with her for years. She knew Ben was reliable and had the right instincts to back her up. Ben, something's not right with the man in row 12. I've been watching him, and I think he might be hiding something, she whispered, trying to keep her voice low but urgent. Ben raised an eyebrow, but didn't question her. He knew Sarah well enough to trust her judgment. Without hesitation, he nodded and said he would keep an eye on him too. Sarah felt a small wave of relief wash over her, but it was fleeting. The man in row 12 hadn't given her any reason to suspect he was dangerous, but everything about him screamed that he was involved in something far more serious than a simple flight. And the longer she waited, the more she felt the weight of that unknown danger pressing in on her. As the minutes passed, Sarah's watchful gaze never left him. His behavior grew even more erratic now. He was muttering to himself under his breath in a low tone, and his fingers were tapping frantically against the armrest, as if trying to calm himself. But it wasn't working. The tension in his body had reached a breaking point, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Then, just as Sarah turned to check on another passenger, she noticed a shift in the air. The man stood up abruptly, his body stiff and tense. And before she could react, he was heading toward the back of the plane, his movements quick and hurried. It was as if he was making a break for something. But what was he trying to do? She couldn't tell, but everything inside her told her this was the moment. She had been dreading the moment when whatever he was hiding would come to the surface. Sarah's heart began to race as she watched him disappear down the aisle and toward the rear of the plane. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift, as well as if everyone could feel the change in energy, and the tension that had been growing for the entire flight was now palpable. Sarah's eyes followed him as he walked quickly down the aisle, his body tense and his head turning this way and that, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched him move. His steps hurried and uneven, his breathing shallow, as though he was on the edge of something too big to control. Sarah felt the sense of urgency rising in her, like a wave crashing over her instincts, screaming at her to act. But she hesitated for a moment, frozen by the uncertainty of what was going on. He reached the back of the plane where the bathrooms were located, and Sarah continued to watch from a distance, her mind racing with possibilities. What was he doing? Why was he so desperate to get to the back of the plane? And why was he acting so paranoid? The questions were piling up faster than she could answer them, and with each passing second her unease grew stronger. Suddenly a small sound broke her concentration, a quiet click followed by the sound of movement. Sarah turned her head toward the back and saw the man standing in front of one of the bathrooms, his hands shaking as he reached for the handle. He was staring at it with such intensity it was as if he were trying to will the door to open, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, and he was becoming more and more frantic, his breathing now heavy and erratic. He glanced around quickly, his eyes darting from one side of the plane to the other, checking to see if anyone was watching. But Sarah could tell he was starting to panic now. His posture was stiff, his hands trembling violently as he pressed them against the door, like he was trying to force it open. She saw the desperation in his face, his eyes wild and unfocused, as if he were on the edge of something he couldn't control. Sarah didn't know what to do. She had to act fast. She couldn't let him get away with whatever was happening, but at the same time she had no idea what he was planning, and whether or not it was something she could handle alone. She reached for her radio to call for backup, but as she did, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye, a movement in the back corner of the cabin. a man standing just out of view watching the scene unfold. His face was partially obscured, but Sarah could see enough to know that he wasn't a regular passenger. The man in the corner was watching the anxious passenger closely, his gaze sharp and calculating. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that this wasn't just a case of a nervous flyer. There was something bigger at play. She could sense it now. The man in row 12 was connected to the stranger in the corner of the cabin, and whatever was going on, it was far more serious than she had imagined. As the man in row 12 continued to struggle with the locked bathroom door, his movements becoming more erratic and frantic, Sarah noticed the stranger move quietly down the aisle toward him. He was trying to remain hidden from view, his steps quick, but calculated, as if he didn't want to draw attention to himself. Sarah's heart began to race as she watched him move closer. She had a bad feeling about this. This wasn't just a random coincidence. There was something planned happening right under her nose, and she needed to stop it before it was too late. The man in the corner of the cabin was now standing just behind the nervous passenger, his face barely visible. As he crept closer, Sarah's mind raced as she quickly realized what was happening. This wasn't just a passenger having a panic attack. This was coordinated. This was a setup. And she was about to witness something much bigger than she had ever imagined. She reached for the intercom system, her fingers trembling. But before she could speak into it, the tension in the air suddenly shifted, and her pulse quickened as she realized that whatever was about to happen wasn't going to be easy to stop. Sarah's heart raced as the man in the corner of the cabin took another step closer, his eyes never leaving the nervous passenger at the back of the plane. The atmosphere had shifted, and Sarah could feel it deep in her bones. The uneasy tension in the air was palpable. Like a fuse waiting to ignite, she knew she had to act fast. But her mind was spinning, trying to process what was happening. How had this turned into something so dangerous so quickly? The man by the bathroom was still struggling with the locked door, his hands shaking violently. As he rattled the handle in desperation, the more he struggled, the more frantic he became, his breathing shallow and erratic. It was clear now that he wasn't just trying to use the restroom. He was trying to hide something, or perhaps trying to prevent something from happening. He was trapped in his own fear, a fear that was consuming him, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder what he was running from, what was so terrifying that it had him acting this way. The stranger who had been watching him now stood only a few steps behind the nervous passenger, his eyes cold, and calculating. There was no mistaking it now. The man wasn't just a concerned fellow traveler. He was part of whatever scheme was unfolding. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to get help, to call for security, but she couldn't risk drawing attention to herself. Not yet, not until she understood exactly what was going on. She kept her eyes fixed on the two men, her every muscle tense, as she tried to make sense of the situation. The man in the corner of the cabin was waiting for the right moment to make his move. Sarah could feel it, she could see it in his posture, the way he stood slightly hunched, his eyes never leaving the nervous passenger, his hand twitching as if he were ready to strike at any moment. And then, just like that, the man by the bathroom stopped shaking. His body went still, his face pale, as if he had come to a decision. His gaze flicked around the cabin again. But this time he wasn't just looking for a way out. He was looking for something else, someone, or perhaps he was looking for confirmation that it was time to make his move. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized that whatever was about to happen was going to happen soon. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The stranger in the back of the cabin was now inching closer to the nervous passenger. Sarah's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. She wanted to call for help, but she couldn't risk alerting the wrong people. She had to wait for the right moment. She had to wait for something to break, for the truth to reveal itself. Just as the man by the bathroom seemed to give up and take a step back, Sarah noticed something strange. She reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal object, something shiny and unfamiliar. At first she couldn't make it out, but as he held it in his trembling hands, She saw the shape of it, a gun, a small pistol, that he was now pointing toward the stranger in the back of the cabin who had just started to move in his direction. The man in the corner stopped dead in his tracks, his face registering shock for the briefest moment. Before his expression hardened again, the gun was now pointed straight at him. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she watched the two men frozen in time, neither one daring to make the next move. The tension in the cabin was unbearable, the passengers around them unaware of the drama unfolding just a few feet away. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She had been trained for emergencies, but nothing had prepared her for this. Not a hostage situation, not a standoff. In the middle of a flight, her heart raced as she weighed her options. She couldn't just stand there and do nothing, but what could she do in a situation like this? How could she stop two armed men from whatever they were planning without escalating the violence? She needed help. She needed to act fast. But every second felt like an eternity. And then the man with the gun did something unexpected. He looked directly at Sarah, for the first time, his eyes locking with hers for a split second. And in that moment she understood something. He wasn't afraid of getting caught. He wasn't afraid of being stopped. He was afraid of something much worse, something that made him willing to go this far, to protect whatever it was he was hiding. Sarah's heart pounded as she stood frozen, her gaze locked with the man holding the gun. His eyes were cold. But there was something else in them, something deeper, something that spoke of fear and desperation. She could see it now. He wasn't just a criminal. He wasn't some mastermind. He was a man trapped in his own circumstances, a man who had been pushed to the edge and was willing to do anything to keep whatever was coming for him at bay. His finger trembled on the trigger, as if he didn't want to hurt anyone, but was willing to do it if necessary. The tension in the air was suffocating. Sarah could feel it closing in around her. The flight attendants, the passengers, they were all oblivious to the danger, unfolding just a few rows away. But Sarah knew this wasn't something that could be ignored. She had to act. She had to figure out a way to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control. She had to think quickly, but the pressure of the moment clouded her thoughts, and all she could focus on was the man and his trembling hands. He slowly inched the gun back down away from the stranger who had been his target, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't done, yet he wasn't finished, and there was a deep sense of urgency in his movements, like time was running out, as if he were trying to stop something from happening, something terrible. And in that moment Sarah understood that this wasn't about the flight or the people around them. This wasn't about her job or her training. This was about the man and whatever had led him to this point. The man looked back at her for a second longer, and Sarah could feel a shift in his expression. It was subtle, but it was there, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps an understanding that she wasn't an enemy, but someone who might be able to help him. His grip on the gun loosened ever so slightly, but that was enough to let Sarah know that she had a window, a small one, but a window nonetheless. She took a slow, steady breath and moved closer, her movements deliberate and calm. She didn't want to startle him. She didn't want to make him feel cornered. She needed to show him that she was someone he could talk to, someone who could help. She needed to make him see that there was another way out of this situation, a way that didn't involve violence or putting anyone's life at risk. The stranger, who had been watching from the back of the cabin, finally spoke up, his voice low and measured, but carrying a clear warning. "Put the gun down," he said, his eyes never leaving the man with the weapon. The man with the gun tensed again, his grip tightening, but Sarah could see the hesitation in his eyes. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to be doing this. But he was terrified of what would happen if he didn't. The man in the back of the cabin took another step forward, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "We can work this out," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to do this. Let us help you." There was a flicker of doubt in the man with the gun's eyes as he glanced between Sarah and the stranger in the back of the cabin. It was brief, but it was enough to show Sarah that there was still a chance to reach him. The flight attendants and passengers continued to go about their business, oblivious to the drama Unfolding just a few feet away, Sarah could feel the weight of their ignorance and the pressure of the moment. The man with the gun was still looking at her, his eyes wild and uncertain, but the flicker of recognition was still there, the hesitation was still there. She took another step forward, speaking softly, but clearly. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "Whatever it is that you're running from, we can find another way, we can help you." She wasn't sure if her words were getting through, but she knew that she had to try. She couldn't let this situation escalate. She couldn't let this man hurt anyone, including himself. The tension hung thick in the air as the seconds dragged on, and for the first time since the man had pulled out the gun, Sarah saw him falter. His finger loosened on the trigger just a fraction, but it was enough for her to see that the fight wasn't over yet. And maybe, just maybe, she could be the one to help him find a way out of this nightmare. Sarah's heart was racing, but she held her composure. She could see the man's hands shaking more now, his grip on the gun loosening just a little, his breath coming in short bursts, as if he were caught between two worlds, one where he was holding a weapon, and the other where he was beginning to question everything that had led him to this moment. His eyes flicked from the gun to Sarah, and then back to the stranger at the back of the plane. His body language told her everything. He was afraid, he didn't want to hurt anyone, but he felt cornered, trapped in a decision that had no easy way out. Sarah knew this was the moment, the tipping point. She had to push carefully. She had to make sure not to threaten him or give him any reason to feel more panicked. She had to reach him and show him that he wasn't alone in this. She took another step forward, her voice soft and gentle but steady. "I know you're scared, but you don't have to do this." She said, her words simple but heavy with meaning. "You don't have to be alone in this." The stranger, who had been silently observing from the back of the plane, took another small step forward, his hands still raised in the air. As a sign of peace, he spoke again, his voice calm and low, but with authority. "We can help you. We can make sure no one gets hurt." The man with the gun looked at him, his eyes wild with uncertainty and desperation. It was clear now that this wasn't a premeditated act of violence. This wasn't some criminal mastermind. This was a man pushed too far by forces that Sarah couldn't even begin to understand. But whatever those forces were, they had driven him to the edge, and now he was on the brink of something that could change everything. The man's eyes flicked back to Sarah, and she could see the inner conflict tearing at him, his mind racing as he weighed the words being spoken to him. The gun was still in his hand, but it was hanging loosely at his side, now almost forgotten in the chaos of his thoughts. Sarah could see it, his fear, his guilt. It was all written on his face. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He didn't want this to escalate, but he didn't know how to stop it. Sarah reached out with her hand, not too fast, but not too slow either. She wanted him to know that she was there for him, that she wasn't afraid of him, and that she wouldn't run away or abandon him. Now she had to make him see that there was a way out, a way to end this, without more violence, without more fear. And she couldn't afford to wait any longer, because every second counted. The man's gaze shifted again from Sarah to the stranger in the back and back to Sarah, as if he were looking for some sign, some assurance that he could trust them, that he could trust her. She didn't know what had happened to him, what had driven him to this point, but she knew that he was just like everyone else, just a human being caught in a difficult situation, trying to find his way out. The silence in the cabin was deafening, and for a moment everything felt frozen, as if time itself had stopped, as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for the next move, waiting to see what would happen next. And then the man spoke, his voice low and hoarse, as if the words had been trapped inside him for far too long. "I didn't mean to get here," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't want this to happen, but I don't know what else to do." His eyes flickered with shame and vulnerability, as if confessing to something he hadn't fully realized until now. Sarah's heart ached for him. She could hear the pain in his voice, and she knew that this wasn't about the weapon, this wasn't about the flight, this was about a man who had been broken by circumstances beyond his control, a man who had made a decision out of fear and desperation, but who didn't want to carry through with it any longer. She took another step closer, but kept her distance, just enough to give him space, but still be within reach. She spoke again, her voice soft and steady. "It's not too late to turn this around," she said. "You can make it right, but you have to trust us." The man looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for the truth, and for the first time since this all began, he looked like he was considering it. His body softened just a little, and the trembling in his hand lessened. The gun, now feeling like a foreign object that no longer belonged in his hand, he was slowly beginning to realize that there was a way out, a way to stop the nightmare from becoming a reality, but the choice was his to make.